Since the 1980s, three beliefs have persisted about growth, inequality, and globalization that typically go on like this. Globalization leads to less global inequality. High income growth for the richest is necessary for income growth for the poorest. There's no alternative to rising inequality. This report, based on new data and analysis, revisits these beliefs. If rising inequality is not properly addressed, it can have catastrophic impacts on a range of political, economic, and social issues. First and foremost, discussions about inequality and its relation to globalization require rigorous and transparent information on income and wealth, which is often difficult to obtain and understand. To provide this information, more than 100 researchers have created the world's most extensive database on income and wealth inequality, the World Inequality Database. WID.World combines data sources on national accounts, household surveys, fiscal data, wealth lists, and estimations of offshore wealth. It is a free database for anyone to access anytime or anywhere in 4 languages. The 2018 report shows that inequality varies greatly across global regions. It is lowest in Europe, where the richest 10% receive less than 40% of the national income. It is highest in the Middle East, where the top 10% capture almost 2/3 of all income. How has income inequality evolved over time? Since 1980, inequality has increased rapidly in North America, China, Russia, and India. It has grown moderately in Europe. In Brazil, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, income inequality has remained relatively stable at extremely high levels. Such diverging trends across countries suggest that the rise in inequality is the result of policy and is not mechanical. The World Inequality Report analyzes trends in global inequality by dividing the global population into 100 groups of equal population size. In regard to income level, we can define 3 broad groups. The poorest 50%, the next 49%, we'll call them the global middle class, the richest 1%. Between 1980 and 2016, the poorest 50% have experienced significant income growth. The global middle class has experienced much less growth, less than 50%. The richest 1% have experienced income growth far higher than any other group. The top 1% is itself composed of smaller groups, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, and so on. As a whole, it captured 27% of total global growth. Despite the rise of emerging countries, the bottom 50% only captured 12% of global income growth. The proportion between wealth owned by the public and private sectors is a key dimension of inequality that is often overlooked. So if wealth can be owned by the private sectors or governments, then private wealth plus public wealth equals national wealth. In the last few years, research has indicated 2 main things about this. First, high levels of private wealth mean that wealth inequality among individuals is likely to be high. Second, low levels of public wealth leave the government with few resources to invest in education, health, and environmental protection, and to tackle inequalities. Since 1980, very large transfers of public to private wealth occurred in nearly all countries, in part because of privatizations. While private wealth has increased substantially, public wealth is now close to zero in rich countries. In some countries, it is negative. This means that if the governments of these countries were to sell all the roads, schools, and capital stock they own, they would not even be able to repay their debts. In the US, for example, in 1980, the top 1% of wealthiest individuals owned about 20% of the household wealth. In 35 years, they've doubled this share. The top 1% now own 40% of the total wealth. Now let's look into the future of economic inequality. Inequality trends within countries have a huge impact on global poverty. If current inequality trends continue, the average income of the poorest 50% of the global population will double by 2050. Alternately, if the U.S. trend described earlier continues, the average income of this group would increase by just over half. But if all countries follow the moderate inequality path observed in the EU since 1980, the average income of the bottom 50% would almost triple by 2050. Policies matter. To tackle global inequality, at least 4 issues need to be addressed. Tax progressivity. Historically, increased tax progressivity has had a substantial impact on reducing income and wealth gaps. Establish a global financial registry. By systematically recording ownership of financial assets, governments could prevent tax evasion. It would provide more money for redistribution, while seriously limiting money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Education. Truly egalitarian access to education is crucial to improve the sluggish income growth of the poorest half of the population. This should be complemented by programs that also improve their access to well-paying jobs. Public investments. If governments are to invest in the future, in education, environmental protection, health, and infrastructure, first, public debt needs to be reduced. Historically, progressive wealth taxation and debt relief have been successful measures to reduce debt and empower younger generations.